The price elasticity of demand also helps to define the shape of our particular demand curves. So there are 5 different shapes that we need to go ahead and take a look at. Here, with our first graph, we have a very relatively elastic demand curve. You notice that, hey, the demand curve is fairly flat. Anytime we have a flat demand curve, we can say that this good, whatever we're taking a look at, is considered to be an elastic demand or relatively elastic. You notice that for a very small change in price, so here we go down just a little bit, we notice that in order for us to get on the demand curve, we need a very, very large change in quantity. So a small percentage change in price leads to a very, very large change in percentage change in quantity demanded. So that matches up very, very well with our idea of what elastic demand means. And we can also take a look at the slope of these demand curves. So with a relatively elastic demand curve, you notice that the slope is going to be fairly small. So rise over run, remember, that is how you define the slope. We have a small rise, so it goes down just a little bit, and then the run is very, very large. So here, that just tells us that the slope is fairly small anytime we have a relatively elastic good. With relatively inelastic goods, however, you notice that the demand curves are fairly steep. Anytime we have a steep demand curve, this good is going to be considered to be inelastic. And as you can see right here, when we change the price by a lot, so we go down a lot, in order for us to get on the demand curve, we just have a small change in quantity demanded. So here, change the price a lot, quantity demanded doesn't change as much, and once again, this matches up with inelastic demand. We are not very sensitive or not very responsive to a change in prices. We change the price a lot, quantity demanded doesn't change very, very much. And once again, once we talk about the slope, this is going to be a fairly large slope. So very, very big rise, fairly small run. So large rise, fairly small run in this instance. So a large slope with inelastic demand. And then here we have unitary elastic. This is exactly where the percentage change in price is matched with a percentage change in quantity demanded. And this is where we're going to have a curved demand curve. So this is going to be a convex demand curve. So it bows inwards, as you can see right here. So if we change price by 13%, that means quantity demand is going to also change by 13% in order for us to get on the same exact demand curve. So as you can see right here, unitary elastic is the only sort of case where we're going to have a curved demand curve as such. There are 2 special cases that we need to go ahead and take a closer look at, and that's where we take a look at the 2 extreme sort of situations with perfectly elastic and perfectly inelastic. Perfectly elastic demand curves are going to have a horizontal demand curve. So here, horizontal demand curve, and it just tells us that for any change in price, quantity demanded goes immediately to 0. So just a change in price of even a minuscule amount, so maybe even 1 cent, all the demand for this particular good is going to go straight to 0. And as we notice with a horizontal demand curve, this curve is going to have a 0 slope. So perfectly elastic demand curves are horizontal in nature and have a 0 slope. So let's go ahead and write this down just so you have it in the back of your mind, because these are the 2 extreme cases that we do take a look at. So here, perfectly elastic. So this just tells us that we are extremely price sensitive to this particular good. It has a demand curve that is a horizontal line. Horizontal line. And we notice that for any change in price, the quantity demanded equals to 0. So for any change in price, QD drops to 0. QD drops to 0. So essentially here, all the demand for this particular good goes away. And it's pretty difficult to think of goods in application and reality that have perfectly elastic demand. But the best example that I can sort of think about is, suppose that you're on campus and there are 2 vending machines standing right next to one another, and both of these vending machines have the same exact items within inside of them. However, the vending machine on the right, the price of all of these sort of goods in the vending machine is 1 cent higher than the vending machine that you have on the left. If you are a rational individual, rational consumer, where would you always go to buy your goods in this vending machine? The vending machine on the left or the vending machine on the right? And that, of course, would be on the vending machine on the left because it is cheaper. So essentially, because the vending machine on the right prices are 1 cent higher, the quantity demanded for every single good within this vending machine goes straight to 0. So in this case, even a very, very small change in price is going to lead to quantity demanded equal to 0. So a little bit of an unusual case once again, but this is what perfectly elastic goods are telling us. A little bit easier for us to see in application are going to be these perfectly inelastic goods, which have a vertical demand line, and it tells us that for any change in price, quantity demanded does not change at all. So essentially, as you can see right here, the slope of a perfectly inelastic demand curve is going to be infinite in this case. So here we change price by 1%, 10%, 100%, 1,000, 1,000,000%, quantity demanded is still going to remain at the same exact amount. So here, let's go ahead and for completion, write this down as well. We have perfectly inelastic demand. Perfectly inelastic, which tells us that we're going to have a vertical line. So vertical line. And the interpretation that we get from this is that for any change in price, we have quantity demanded remaining the same. So does not change. Or we can say remains the same. So here, notice that remains the same or does not change is not the exact same thing as zero here. They do mean two different things. So with perfectly inelastic, it's a vertical line. For any change in price, quantity demanded does not change, and the slope of the demand curve is infinite. And it's actually a little bit easier for us to go ahead and think of a few examples of goods that exhibit perfectly inelastic demand. One that we brought up in the previous lecture was gasoline. So no matter what we change the price on gasoline, our quantity demanded pretty much isn't going to change at all. If we change the price of gasoline from 100%, so maybe say from $2.50 to $5 per gallon, we are still going to be buying roughly the same amount of gasoline. So it is a good that exhibits very, very closely to a perfectly inelastic good. And we can also have life-saving medication. And we notice that a lot of pharmaceutical companies raise the prices on life-saving medication by a very, very large percentage a lot of the time. So a good example is the EpiPen. The creators of the EpiPen, Mylan, they raised the prices of the EpiPen, this life-saving medication, by nearly 700 to 800%. And basically, they knew that, hey, people need this life-saving medication, so let's go ahead and raise the prices as much as we can because we know that they're going to have to buy this good no matter what. And basically, life-saving medication in this case is considered to be a perfectly inelastic good. So it doesn't matter if we raise the prices just by 1%, 100%, or even the 700 or 800% that we saw with the EpiPen. We are still going to buy this good no matter what. So here are 5 different shapes that the demand curve can take, and it all depends on the price elasticity of demand. Are we price sensitive with relatively elastic demand? Remember, it's pretty flat. Are we price insensitive with a steep demand curve with relatively inelastic? Are we unitary elastic where we have a curved convex demand curve? Are we perfectly elastic with a horizontal demand curve? Or are we perfectly inelastic where we have a vertical demand curve? And you may be wondering to yourself exactly how exactly do we define whether a good is considered to be more elastic or more inelastic? We'll go ahead and take a look at that in our next video where we take a look at the determinants of elasticity.